All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we're going to be looking at John 10, 1 through 21. And this section gives us an absolutely beautiful picture of who Jesus is by his own description and what he offers because of who he is. And in context, this is the last recorded speech of Jesus in the Gospel of John to the crowds and the leaders. There are other speeches in the second half of John's Gospel, but they happen when he's alone with his disciples, primarily in the upper room or around the upper room moment the night before Jesus is crucified. So this is the last speech that we have to the masses, to the crowds in the Gospel of John. And scholars wrestle with exactly how it connects in the flow of thought here. In fact, some even contend that it doesn't really connect with the story at the end of chapter 9. Nevertheless, the way John tells the story, particularly in verse 21, he seems to connect it with chapter 9. It's connected there in verse 21 with the opening of the eyes of the blind man. So I think it's best just to see this as connected with the preceding story in some sort of way, because that's how John presents it. And exactly how does it connect? Well, it reasserts that Jesus is the dividing line. He is the door. That is the only way into the sheep pen or the sheepfold of God's flock. He is, as he says here, the good shepherd, the one who faithfully cares for and leads God's people. And so by rejecting Jesus, as many of the leaders do at the end of chapter 9, they're actually on the outside of the sheepfold of God. And the blind man in chapter 9, by believing in Jesus, has actually rightly recognized who the good shepherd is, and he has found the door into God's sheepfold. Now, beyond that immediate context, there's also some theological context that's really important for us to keep in mind. God is described in the Old Testament as Israel's true shepherd. Think, for example, of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Or Isaiah chapter 40, verses 10 and 11, where God once again is the shepherd of Israel. And Israel's leaders in the Old Testament prophets are frequently described as shepherds, and they're usually pictured as bad shepherds, not good shepherds. Think, for example, of Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 1 through 3, that says, Then the word of the Lord came to me, Ezekiel, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. That is, against their kings and their leaders and their princes. Prophesy and say to those shepherds, this is what the Lord God says. Woe, shepherds of Israel, who've been feeding themselves. Should the shepherds not feed the flock? Ye eat the fat, clothe yourselves with wool. You slaughter the fat sheep without feeding the flock. And as it goes on, it promises a day when God himself will come and look after his flock. He will be their shepherd. In fact, Jeremiah 23 uses the exact same imagery. It says, Woe to the shepherds who are causing the sheep of my pasture to perish and are scattering them, declares the Lord. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the shepherds who are tending my people. You've scattered my flock, you've driven them away, you have not been concerned about them, and behold, I am going to call you to account for the evil of your deeds, declares the Lord. Then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I've driven them. I will bring them back to their pasture, and they will be fruitful and multiply. And then it goes on there in Jeremiah to actually give the promise of God's righteous branch, the Messiah, whom we now know as Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And so Jesus, here in John chapter 10, by describing himself as the Good Shepherd, using this imagery of sheep and shepherd, he's using well-established imagery, both culturally and theologically. And so it fits very well with the message Jesus wants to say to the leaders of his day and what he wants to say about himself. And so John chapter 10, verse 1 opens this way. Truly, truly, I say to you, Jesus is speaking, the one who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he's a thief and a robber. Now, while this feels like an abrupt opening for what Jesus wants to say, bear in mind the connection with chapter 9. Jesus has been interacting with the leaders and the crowds, and they've rejected him again. And so Jesus is now addressing them with this metaphor, this picture of sheep and shepherding. And he is saying that the person who doesn't actually come in through the entryway into the sheep pen, who climbs over the sidewall, that person is a thief and a robber, not a legitimate shepherd of the sheep. And sheep and shepherding was just a basic part of Jesus' world. Everyone knew the basics of how it worked. It was completely and totally familiar. So Jesus uses some familiar details to teach a lesson about himself and about his flock, the true flock of God. And it was common in their world, as part of the way shepherding worked, for sheep to graze on the open hills around the city of Jerusalem or Bethlehem or the towns, just to graze on the open hills and then be herded into a sheep pen for the night. Out in the hills, the pen was typically a small walled enclosure, sometimes backing up to a cave or a cliff. And there would be an opening in that enclosure where the sheep could come in by. And that entrance would often be blocked off with like some thorn bushes, or maybe the shepherd himself would sit in that opening all night long to guard the sheep. That's the picture that Jesus is playing off of here. Here is this opening. Now, somebody who sneaks up and climbs up over the wall of the sheep, he obviously doesn't have good intention. Somebody who's unknown to the shepherd sitting in the doorway of the sheep pen, right? That's an intruder with evil intentions. But the shepherd for maybe each different flock that's now housed in this pen for the night, well, he comes to the door and he's well known. And so Jesus continues the imagery in verse 2 by saying, "But the one who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep listen to his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts all his sheep outside, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice." The imagery as it's used here suggests a large sheep pen with actually several flocks in it, flocks managed by different shepherds. So one particular shepherd in this imagery comes to the door of the pen, presumably in the morning, to gather up his sheep and to usher them out into the hillsides for open grazing for the day. And he comes to the door. The doorkeeper recognizes him, knows that he's a shepherd of one of the flocks of the sheep, and he has his own unique call, his own unique way of leading his sheep. His sheep recognize his call. They follow him out of the sheep pen. In fact, Gary Burge, in one of his books, actually describes how this is true still today in many parts of the Middle East. Middle Eastern shepherds talk to their sheep. They sing to their sheep. Sometimes they might even play a small flute. And they can actually separate their own sheep out from other sheep simply by their own unique call, by their flute playing, by their singing, by their voice. And that's what Jesus is describing in verses 2 and 3. A shepherd comes to the door, calls forth his sheep. They follow him out into the hillsides for open grazing. However, verse 5, a stranger they simply won't follow. They don't know his voice. They don't know his call. He doesn't know how to speak to them. And they won't follow him out of the sheep pen, but will flee from him because they don't know the voice of a stranger. Now, verse 6, John explains, Jesus told them this figure of speech, but they did not understand what the things which he was saying to them meant. So all of this, in other words, in verses 1 through 5, was an illustration, an analogy from the familiar experiences of shepherding from the day. And those listening to Jesus, they understood the picture because they knew what shepherding was about, but there was a bit of a like, yeah, okay, got that. That's the way shepherding works. But like, what are you talking about? And so Jesus goes on in the following verses and he explains what he's talking about, and he does so by applying the imagery to himself. And so he begins this way in verse 7. He says, "So Jesus said to them again, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. He's going to mix his metaphors, and he's going to call himself the good shepherd in a little bit. But first he starts with, I'm like the door. I'm like the entry point for the flock of God. If you want to enter into the sheepfold of God, you got to come through me. You got to go out through me. I'm the one sitting in the door. I'm the gatekeeper. I'm the door itself. He's the one who permits entry, and any who attempt to enter the flock by any other way are not true shepherds, are illegitimate. He's the door of the sheep. He goes on in verse 8 and says, all those who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep, that is the true sheep, the ones who really know God and want to follow God, they didn't listen to him. Who are those who came before? Well, it's not 100% clear, but it probably refers to others who asserted their own leadership over Israel or over God's people, or people who claimed to be the Messiah or the deliverer of Israel. And there had been plenty of those people in the decades before Jesus. In fact, even during Jesus' life, after Jesus' life, there were plenty of Jews who donned the mantle of deliverer or Messiah, and they were going to liberate and lead the nation. Jesus says that all those kind of people were thieves and robbers. They didn't really have the best interest of the sheep at heart. They weren't the true shepherd of Israel. This probably would even, in some ways, hint at maybe the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders that have been debating with Jesus, rejecting Jesus, and hostile towards Jesus over the last few chapters of John's gospel. Jesus wants everyone to recognize that he's the true door. He's the true entryway. He's not a thief or a robber. That's others. In fact, he goes on in verse 9 to amplify. He restates and amplifies this picture. He says again, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. Jesus is the way into the flock of God. And what does he promise? Well, he promises good pasture. You'll go in and out and you'll find good pasture. Everything a sheep needs for healthy living, good pasture. He's promising being cared for and providing for as a sheep. Like you're going to be taken care of. You will be delivered. You will be rescued. You will be saved. And the contrast between what Jesus is and what Jesus offers and what others are is stark. Look at verse 10. The thief, those who came before, those who asserted their own leadership, those who went their own way, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. That's his ultimate intent. That's the ultimate effect. He's in it for himself. He wants to get things for himself, so he's going to ultimately serve himself. He comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus says about himself, I came so that they, that is the sheep, the flock of God, God's people, I came so that they would have life and have it abundantly. I didn't come to enhance my own life. I didn't come to serve myself and enlarge myself. I came so that the sheep could have life and have it abundantly. Someone climbing over the wall who's a thief and isn't clearly interested in caring for the sheep, right? His intent is malicious, to steal, kill, and destroy, but not so with Jesus. Sheep under Jesus' care have everything they need: food, water, protection, life in abundance, as we take the imagery. They have everything they need. They have abundant life. And this statement tells us something very important about Jesus. He offers life. And not only does he offer it, he actually has the ability to give it. I came that they should have life and life abundantly. And this is actually at the heart of the message of the Gospel of John, that Jesus came to give life. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. John told us that in the prologue, which sets the direction for the gospel. And here in this climactic moment, this final speech to the crowd, we have this profound statement from Jesus that that's what's on offer. He's offering life. To trust Jesus is to gain life. And not just any kind of life. Jesus says he offers life abundantly. And that word abundantly has the sense of overflow or lavish, like more than enough. I'm offering life abundantly. And not only did Jesus say he's the door to the sheep pen, but look at verse 11. I am the good shepherd. So not only is the door, he's the entryway where people go in and out into the sheepfold of God, but he is the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The good shepherd isn't trying to get what he can from the sheep. He's not trying to just steal and kill and eat the sheep. He's not just trying to use the sheep for his own advantage. Rather, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's the evidence that that Jesus is the good shepherd. He's going to lay down his life for the sheep. Not just metaphorically, that's going to happen very soon. We're just weeks away from that experience where Jesus literally lays down his life for the sheep. And then Jesus goes on and explains more and fleshes this out a whole lot more. And he does so at first with a contrast. Look what he says in verse 12. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them, scatters the flock, and he flees because he's a hired hand and he doesn't care about the sheep. So in the contrast, Jesus, who lays down his life for the sheep, this guy, he's just a hired hand. The sense here is he's not even a good hired hand. He's a self-serving hired hand. He's just in it for the money. He's just doing this for some work to get what he can get. He's not really interested in the sheep. He doesn't have anything invested in the sheep, and he doesn't really care for the sheep. Jesus also says that he's not the owner of the sheep. So he has nothing at stake in these sheep. He's just out there for what he can get. So he sees the wolf coming and he's just going to save his own skin. He just immediately runs away and flees, leaves the sheep to fend for themselves. Not a fair fight between the wolf and the sheep. And he does this, Jesus says, because he's a hired hand, doesn't care about the sheep. But not Jesus. Look at verse 14. Jesus says again, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Pay attention to this picture. There's this sense of intimacy between Jesus and the sheep. It's a kind of intimacy that's similar to the intimacy between the Father God and Jesus himself. Like they have this connection, this union, this intimacy. And Jesus says it's the same. I know my own sheep just the way the Father knows me. My own sheep know me just the way I know my Father. And I don't save myself. I lay down my life on behalf of the sheep. I actually think of them first and I lay down myself. Then Jesus says in verse 16 something a bit surprising. He says, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold. What's he talking about? Well, when he says this fold, that refers to the current fold of Jews. That's who he's been ministering to. That's been the focus of his ministry. That's who he's talking to. It's the Jewish fold. I have other sheep that aren't part of this current Jewish fold. In other words, in the original context, this refers to Gentiles. Jesus here, in other words, is already indicating that he's going to bring in sheep from the Gentile world into his sheep pen, his people. I have other sheep that aren't part of this Jewish fold, i.e. they're Gentiles, and they're going to come and be part of my sheepfold as well. And so he goes on in verse 16 and says, I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. Jesus already paints this picture that there's going to be this one unified flock between Jews and Gentiles with one shepherd, Jesus himself, overseeing them, leading them, and caring for them. And then Jesus concludes by driving home the central point. He's the good shepherd, and he lays down his life for his own. So verse 17, he says, for this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it back again. Like Jesus is saying that this is what the Father sent me to do. It's what I'm going to do. And the Father loves me because I'm willing to do that for him and for me and for my sheep. And so And not only that, there's this hint when he says, I lay down my life so that I may take it back. There's this hint that laying down his life is actually going to culminate in Jesus taking his life back up again. In fact, verse 18, he's going to say he actually has the power and the authority to do that. No one has taken it away from me. No one has taken my life from me. I lay it down on my own, of my own initiative, of my own choosing, of my own volition. Jesus knows he's going to die. He knows that's coming. He knows it's just around the corner. And here he actually says, this was by my choice. This was what I chose to do. I have authority to lay it down. And I have authority to take it back again. This commandment I received from my Father. This instruction, this is what my Father sent me to do. This is what he told me to do. I'm choosing to do it. I actually have the authority both to lay it down and to take it back up again. Well, in response to these words about Jesus being the door and the good shepherd, and him being the true shepherd of the sheep, and he's the one who's going to lead them, in response to that, once again, the crowd is mixed. Look at verse 19. Dissension occurred again among the Jews because of these words. This is actually the third time that John has noted this for us in his gospel. We saw it in 7:43, we saw it in chapter 9, verse 16, and we have it again here. The crowd is split. They're mixed on this. Many of them, verse 20, were saying, he has a demon and is insane. Why would you listen to him? They're like, he's crazy. How can he make these claims for himself? Others were saying, these aren't the words of one who is demon possessed. A demon can't open the eyes of the blind, can he? Which harkens back to the miracle that started all of this in chapter 9. A demon can't do that. No, that doesn't make sense. And so the crowd is mixed, the crowd is split, and many are struggling to really believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be. Now, before we leave this story, let me just offer a couple brief reflections. The first is this, and it's just really an invitation to you and to me to just step back. Let's just step back and reflect on what Jesus has said here. What do we learn about Jesus? Well, he describes himself as the good shepherd. He's in and among the sheep. He cares for sheep. They know his voice. Why? Because there's this intimacy with him. They listen to him and he listens to them and they interact and he's present among them and with them. And so there's this connection, this intimacy. And not only that, he's the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. His sheep are so important to him that he doesn't seek to preserve himself or protect himself or serve himself. He lays down his life for the sheep. He is described here as the one who gives himself so that his sheep can have everything they need. They can find good pasture and they can have abundant life. And as I listen to these words of Jesus, I cannot help but think of Psalm 23, where God is the shepherd of his people. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He leads me beside still waters, right? He leads me into green pastures. Even when I have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. You prepare a table for me, even in the presence of my enemies. Surely goodness and loving kindness are going to follow me all the days of my life, and I'm going to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the promise of Psalm 23. And Jesus is the living, breathing embodiment of that psalm. He's the good shepherd who lays down his life so that his sheep can be protected, preserved, rescued, and delivered and have everything they need. The second little reflection I want to offer on this is really very simple, and it's the overall challenge, I think, of this chapter within the book of John, within the Gospel of John, and that is, do you believe this? Do you believe what Jesus said about himself? I think that's why the story ends with this mixed picture. There's dissension between the crowds. Some are saying, wait a second, these aren't the words of a demon. Others are saying, the guy's crazy. This isn't true. And the question for you and for me is, what about us? Do we genuinely and deeply believe that Jesus is the good shepherd and that he can be trusted with our life because he has our best interest at heart? All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Gospel of John. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So to each and every one of you who gives to make this ministry possible, first of all, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Literally, this ministry would not exist without you. And second of all, I want you to be encouraged because based on the emails I receive and the stories I hear, God is using your generosity through this ministry to bear good fruit for his name's sake. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been blessed or impacted by this ministry, could I invite you to just consider maybe joining the team of supporters? There is so much stuff I want to do. It all takes time and resources to do it. I want to get transcripts up of the commentary on the website. Takes time and effort to get that done. I would love to use some of the current resources to create, say, a Spanish version with Spanish transcripts of this to reach a whole nother segment of the world. There's just so much stuff that could be done. All takes time and resources. And so could I invite you to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters so that this ministry can continue to grow and impact more and more people all around the world. Thanks a ton for your support.